I would like to welcome Lada Kolomiyets and Olexa Kundzič today. We're going to talk about very pressing issue today. Especially, we're going to talk about relations between Russia and Ukraine, especially from point of view of translation. And we often tend to see translation as something building bridges, basically, and something connecting cultures. But we don't tend to think about translation as a tool to build bridges, actually, and to show that you are self-sufficient. And I'm not quite sure that we fully realize that translation can actually hurt very often. And that's why we're having experts who are going to talk about that today. As I said, Lada and Alexander. Well, what is quite interesting to me is that they're both extremely active writers. They keep writing and researching history, especially translation history. And going back to Brian Baer, as Alexander indicated recently, we are fighting against myth history, as Brian Baer called it. So we basically do have this erased history of translation studies, which was written in Ukrainian language. And we never had a chance to access it because it was either written in Ukrainian or it was erased. Actually, Alexander referred to erasure studies recently. He may go back during his lecture to that. But now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Lada Kolomiyets, who is a professor at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. And at the moment, she's visiting professor at the Dartmouth College in the United States. She's very well written. She's well known, especially nowadays, because she is leading expert in, so to say, new translation history. I'm very glad, Lada, that you accepted our invitation. You're going to talk about the bright and dark sides of translating Russian literature in Soviet Ukraine. And then we're going to have a short discussion afterwards. So thank you for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Considering translation a deeply ambivalent concept and practice, I will pinpoint its functional duality. This feature is particularly important to recall while surveying the inherently ambivalent role of translation in Russo-Ukrainian dialogue. As a part of the historiographic description of Russian literature in Ukrainian translations, I examine reprints and retranslations alongside the first translated editions. My study also incorporates translator biographies and their individual voices in paratexts. The processes of Soviet politicization of the language of translation constitute an important aspect of my research. I will shorten, if it's possible, my presentation, oral presentation without slides. Ukrainian writer translators of the Soviet period faced political repression, persecution for nationalism, accusations of nationalistic wrecking in translation, arrests and executions, while their translations were either destroyed or ruthlessly edited linguistically and ideologically, and many of them even several times. Classical Russian poets were the foundation for the Soviet canon of Russian literature. The first Soviet voluminous editions of translations of Russian literature fell on poetry. In 1925, the first anthology of Russian poetry in Ukrainian translations, edited by Boris Yakubsky, appeared in Kharkiv. It included translations by the rising star of Ukrainian modernistic poetry, Pavlo Tychina, as well as translations from Afanasy Fett and Alexander Blok, by perhaps the most productive and congenial translator of Russian classical poetry, Maxim Rylsky. The same year, 1925, a collection of Valery Brusov's poems was published in Kyiv. The collection contained 14 translations by the unofficial leader of a group of Kyiv poets called the Neoclassics, Mykola Zerov, as well as translations by the group members, Pavlo Filipovich in particular. These two editions of 1925 initiated the rapid development of Ukrainian poetic translations from Russian classics, which entered the golden fund of translated literature and became the foundation of the Ukrainian School of Artistic Translation. We should remember this for many reasons. First and foremost, because these translations truly founded the artistic school of translation in Ukrainian translatology. The neoclassics came to be the main agents of the formation of the artistic translation, as I said. They professed the classical idea of balance and harmony in verbal art and cared about the refinement of literary form. Their broad erudition, perfect command of foreign languages, Russian in particular, and natural talents afforded them increasing opportunities to achieve freedom from superficial literalism in translation. The impetuous development of Ukrainian poetic translation from Russian endured until the mid-1930s, when a wave of Stalinist terror swept over Ukrainian culture. A quantitative growth and high artistic quality of translations were largely ensured by the translative and editorial activities of Zerov, Rylsky, and Filipovich, whom I just mentioned, who were the main driving force, first and foremost, in the implementation of a large-scale project of Ukrainian Pushkin in particular. Let me tell you a couple of words about this project. Alexander Pushkin was most often translated of the Russian classical poets into Ukrainian. The 1927 collection of his selected works, edited by Filipovich, comprised translations by Rylsky, including the play A Feast in Time of Plague. The second edition of selected works by Pushkin, supplemented and revised, was published in 1930. It contained new translations by Rylsky, translations by Zerov, as well as a new translation of the poem I Have Erected a Monument, presented even in two translations by Rylsky and by Zerov in notes. Since the mid-1930s, many retranslations have been made from Pushkin and beyond. Almost the only reason for retranslations was a ban on the name and works of the repressed translator, as it happened in the case of Mykola Voronej, a renowned poet, drama critic, and theater director, in whose translation the tale of the priest and his workman Balda by Pushkin saw the light of day in 1930, but it was retranslated by Rylsky for the 1936 collection and later reprinted. In 1937, the year associated with the 100th anniversary of the death of Pushkin, a 2-volume collection of the poet's selected works was printed. Volume 1 featured several translations by the cult Soviet poet Tychina. At that time, Tychina was widely famous. Also, the reprinted translations by Rylsky, the debut translations by the famous, in the future, Soviet poet Leonid Pervomaisky, and 8 translations by the prominent early 20th century master of the sonnet, Mykola Chernявsky. Volume 2 contained the premiere translation of the novel in verse Eugen Onegin by Maxim Rylsky. Also, in 1937, a volume of Pushkin's selected prose appeared. So, all in all, up to 20 separate books in translations of Pushkin's works appeared in print in Soviet Ukraine in 1 year, in 1937, not counting innumerable publications in periodicals, which fact testifies to the establishment of Pushkin's figure as the most authoritative canonical writer of the Soviet literature, which was being formed at that time. It was in 1937, on the crest of Stalin's purges, that the all-union cult of Pushkin was established, in other words. The icon of Pushkin as a great Russian poet-statesman had to serve the unification of national republics around the quote-unquote great and powerful Russia. Numerous translations and reprints of Pushkin's works in the year 1937 testify to this fact quite eloquently. Pushkin became the #1 classic in the official canon of Russian literature formed by Stalin, while, let's say, Mikhail Lermontov was allotted a smaller area, truly a small area in this canon. Hence, of the works of Lermontov published as separate books, only the 1936 edition of the Song of the Merchant Kalashnikov can be mentioned. As early as 1930, the literary critic Elizaveta Starinkevich, in a Russian language review of books translated into Ukrainian in 1929-30, argued that in comparison with the pace of translation of canonical Western authors, the rate of translating Russian masterworks was unsatisfactory because many big names in the genres of prose and drama were still waiting for Ukrainian publishers to fill the gap. From the early 1930s, we can say that this gap was quickly filled. By the late 1930s, the Ukrainian dynamics for publishing translated books revealed a significant predominance of Russian and Russian language literature. The critics and editors of that time paid special attention to stylistic peculiarities of translating canonical Russian authors of the 19th and early 20th century. And let me pinpoint this fact, specifically of those authors with Ukrainian background, how to translate, to render properly the style of those authors, or of the authors whose writings were stylistically close to Ukrainian linguistic patterns or topics. First and foremost, among them were Gogol, Anton Chekhov, and Nikolai Leskov, whose works contain significant Ukrainian elements, both stylistic and thematic. A literary critic of the early Soviet period, Volodymyr Derzhavin, singled out these authors as belonging to both Russian and Ukrainian literature. It was truly a daring statement. Gogol was the most frequently translated author, although Pushkin, the #1 classic in the official canon of Russian literature in the USSR, which I just demonstrated, outstripped Gogol by the number of separate publications. Various works by Gogol appeared in separate Ukrainian editions each year from 1926 to 1937. Works translated in the early 1920s were retranslated during this period. In the 1930s, several separate publications appeared each year, publications of Gogol in translation. More than 24 translators, including prominent writers and skilled stylists, were involved in the Gogol translation industry. In Ukrainian, Mykola Gogol, In commemoration of Gogol's evenings on a farm near Dekanka, the Ukrainian publishing house Knigospilka, for instance, scheduled the first 5-volume Ukrainian collection of Gogol's works, Tvori, works, to appear between 1929 and 1932. The team of translators included recognized authors, Rylsky and Mykola Zerov among them. However, only 3 of the planned 5 books emerged, the first, the second, and the fourth volumes. Knigospilka's publication in 1929-30 of Chekhov's selected works, Вибрані твори, under Vasily Ivanushkin's and Rylsky's editorship, became another outstanding event in Ukrainian translation, and in particular in Ukrainian Chekhoviana. This was intended as a 3-volume collection, but similarly to the truncated collection of Gogol's works planned for the same publisher, by the same publisher, only 2 of 3 projected volumes were produced. Prose works from classical Russian literature began to be translated extensively in the 1930s. Leo Tolstoy's prose appeared first from various publishing houses, in particular Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth from Knigospilka, and others. From the mid-1930s onwards, the state publishing house of the Ukrainian SSR monopolized all subsequent publications, producing the first book of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy in a translation by the well-regarded writer, poet, and editor Oleksii Varava. This was followed by various short stories, all of War and Peace, and the Sevastopol sketches. Ivan Turgenev's works were also widely translated. For example, his cycle of short stories as sportsman's sketches was published in 1924, 30, and 35 by several publishing houses and in different translations, often, by the way, without mentioning the translators. It would become almost a regular practice from the mid-1930s. In 1936, crucial works from the Soviet canon of classical Russian literature appeared in Ukrainian. Specifically, Nikolai Chernyshevsky's novel, What is to be Done, Alexander Griboyedov's comedy, Woe from Wheat, and Ivan Goncharov's Oblomov. Alexander Ostrovsky's plays were printed in 1936 in Harchenko's translation, and Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin was also well represented by successive translations of his major works, in particular, The History of a Town, A Tale of How One Man Fed 2 Generals, and the novel The Golovlyov Family. Let's talk a little bit about Soviet Russian prose and dramatic works in translation. The most popular Soviet author was Maxim Gorky, whose novel Mother, translated by Varava, whom I just mentioned, and edited by Sergei Pilipenko, a famous leader of the Union of Peasant Writers, Pluh, the Plow, was first published in Ukrainian translation in 1928. My Universities, translated by Mikhailo Lebedinets under the editorship of Pilipenko, also appeared that year, 1928. It was retranslated by Maria Pelinska and Ivan Dniprovsky in 1933, with only Pelinska name as translator when the translation was republished by the same publisher in the following year. 1928 also saw the publication of Gorky's Foma Gordeyev, translated by Elizaveta Kardinalovska and reprinted in 1935, Gorky, by the way, had opposed his translations, the translations of his works into Ukrainian, considering Ukrainian a Little Russian rather than a fully fledged language. Gorky actually demonstrated an imperialist prejudice, specifically in his 1927 letter to Olexa Kundzič, editor-in-chief of the Knihospilka Publishing Cooperative, declining permission to translate his novel Mother into Ukrainian and thrice referring to that language as a narechia dialect. However, Slisarenko eventually managed to persuade Gorky to agree to the translation. Gorky's main argument against translating into Ukrainian was that an average Ukrainian reader can read any work of Russian literature in the original. His personal conviction contradicted the general policy of the ruling Communist Party of the Soviet Union, however, which aimed at that time at indigenization, and in the case of Ukraine, Ukrainization, the use of the Ukrainian language in education, culture, literature, science, and office work in order to establish Soviet ideological slogans in Ukrainian mass culture. In 1929, the Russian language literary and art journal of the All Ukrainian Union of Proletarian Writers, Red Word, published a review article entitled Translated Literature in Ukraine by the philologist Alexander Bieletsky. The author of the article argued that the main priority when commissioning translations for a Ukrainian readership was to offer as many translations into Ukrainian as possible, both from Russian and direct translations from other foreign languages, to develop a Ukrainian canon of world literature. Moreover, Bieletsky compared reading world literature in Russian rather than Ukrainian translation to consuming a surrogate that, quote unquote, upsets the natural growth and development of thought, which is inseparable from words, is being formed by words, end of quote. The critic Derzhavin, whom I also mentioned, had also called for the formation of a Ukrainian canon of world literature. Arguments in favor of Ukrainian translations from Russian prevailed, and Gorky's works continued to be published in abundance. From 1928 to 1966, Gorky's writings in Ukrainian translation totaled 186 separate editions. The Ukrainian language proved capable, thus, of meeting the demands placed on it by the subject matter and style of the translated works. The expenditure of effort and money on translating Russian canonical writings fully justified itself. The rapid appearance of numerous translations became a living refutation of the idea of the uselessness and futility of translations from Russian into Ukrainian, and the business of Russian to Ukrainian translation developed relatively smoothly until 1934. That summer, a conference of translators and editors of Gorky's works was held at the Central Committee of the Ukrainian Communist Party. Subsequently, the Ukrainian language literary newspaper published an article which severely criticized recent publications of Gorky's works into Ukrainian, accusing them of deliberately avoiding homophones common to Russian and Ukrainian. The article announced that Gorky's books would be retranslated using a different, more literal strategy. This reproachment would, with the Russian language, extended to translations of other authors, for instance, including those of the socialist realist canon, which was also under formation. The socialist realist author was in particular Mikhail Sholokhov. and exemplary socialist realist author of that period. In the spirit of combating nationalistic wrecking, a devastating critique of the translation by Pilipenko of Sholokhov's novel Virgin Soil Upturned appeared in literary newspaper on the 20th of August 1934. It was 4 months after Pilipenko was executed on March 3rd, 1934. Whether or not the author of the article, Yevgen Kasyanenko, knew at the time of writing that Pilipenko was no longer alive remains unclear. Shortly before his arrest, Pilipenko had submitted his translation of Virgin Soil Upturned in manuscript to the Literature and Art Publishing House. Although Kasyanenko was also working on the translation of this novel, Virgin Soil Upturned, so he wrote a severely critical article against Pilipenko's translation. However, the two men were certainly not ideologically opposed. They had cooperated smoothly before the arrest and liquidation of Pilipenko. Yet Kasyanenko retranslated Sholokhov's highly popular Soviet novel, Virgin Soil Upturned, which he eventually published in Literature and Art Publishing House in 1934, when the publishing house withdrew Pilipenko's previously submitted translation. This dramatic story shows how tightly intertwined personal motives and psychological attitudes were with allegedly political decisions and actions, particularly when the translator's ego turns out to be the main trigger of political accusations of one's literary predecessors and rivals. Even assuming that Kasyanenko knew about Pilipenko's execution before publishing his denunciatory article, he did not seem concerned about how his defamatory remarks would affect the lives of Pilipenko's family and followers. The publishing microhistory of Ukrainian translations of Sholokhov's works in particular, which includes paratext and biographical data about translators, is very revealing for the whole process of Russian to Ukrainian Soviet translation. After the Soviet authorities stopped trusting Kasyanenko, by the way, the novel Virgin Soil Upturned appeared in a new translation by Stepan Kovhaniuk. Kasyanenko was arrested on July 11th, 1937 and executed the same year. After World War II, only a few Ukrainian writer translators from Russian survived Stalin's purges and remained active. In particular, Rylsky, Tychina, Mykola Bazhan, Mykola Terещенко, Leonid Pervomaysky, Natalia Zabila, besides Volodymyr Sosyura, Andriy Golovko, Yuri Yanovsky, Andriy Malishko, and some others. However, translations from Russian increased rapidly. From 1946 to 55, translations into Ukrainian totaled 310 volumes of Russian pre-Soviet classics and 413 books by modern Russian authors. Ukrainian publishing houses printed translations of prose works by 180 Russian authors in the post-war period, including 28 classics. The total circulation of these translations was about 25 million copies. Stepan Kovhaniuk, a translator from Russian, estimates that in the mid-1950s, 58 people translated Russian classics, including 30 writers and 28 professional translators. This group can be further narrowed to about 30 writers and professional translators who were engaged in translation constantly, with at least a dozen translations to their credit. of those 30 writers, Kovhaniuk names only 5 leading translators: Rylsky, Tychina, Mikhailo Stelmach, Kundzič, and Golovko. I'm afraid I've run out of time. I could proceed if I have time.
We have an additional, I think, 5-6 minutes. So, and then you can go on, and then we can start the discussion.
Thank you, Martin. Having defined a perfect translation as a translation when the reader forgets about the translator at the end, does not see him in the text, Kovhaniuk points to Rylsky, whose translations, quote unquote, could be unconditionally called perfect and exemplary in this respect. Kovhaniuk specifically refers to Rylsky's translations from Gogol, and in particular, the tale of how Ivan Ivanovich quarreled with Ivan Nikiforovich. The translator's invisibility is guaranteed, in Kovhaniuk's view, by the fluency of the cultivated translating language. Among new translations, which fall short of exemplary status, Kovhaniuk mentions Stelmach's and Golovko's 1954 translation of Pushkin's The Tale of the Late Ivan Petrovich Belkin, and some other works. On the one hand, by the mid-1950s, Ukrainian writers had already made all the best works of Russian artistic and philosophical thought, the spiritual heritage of They made Russian artistic and philosophical thought the spiritual heritage of the Ukrainian people, according to Kundzič, another famous translator from Russian, who was both a practitioner and theoretician of Russian to Ukrainian translation. So Kundzič's summary is like that. However, the problem of insufficient quality of most post-war translations arose in the mid-1950s. The ban on translations published during the 1920s and early 30s gave rise to the appearance of a massive scale from the mid-1930s of the so-called edited translations, while the names of translators who were arrested and executed completely disappeared from printed editions, as if they had never existed. A repressed person's translations underwent ruthless and repeated editions and had to be published without the translator's name, only with the label "translation edited by such and such," or even with an abbreviated version of this label, "edited translation." The role of literary editor was reduced thus to transforming the Ukrainian literary language into a pale shadow of the Russian language. If you take a closer look at the translations of 1946-50, says Stepan Kovhaniuk, you can see, quote unquote, that they are all marked by the heavy seal of all-binding literalism. It was, so to speak, a sign of the time, a period of editorial arbitrariness, when the translator sometimes could not recognize his translation after the book was published. The editor's pen would mercilessly and consistently cross out any living word that, quote unquote, deviated from the original, that is, was not a calque in Kovhaniuk's own words, end of Kovhaniuk's quote. So Kovhaniuk, whose corrected complete translation of Sholokhov's novel And Quiet Flows the Dawn in 4 volumes, which appeared in 1955, Kovhaniuk experienced this editorial insistence of literalism personally. As a speaker at a formal meeting of Ukrainian translators in Kyiv on February 16, 1956, Kovhaniuk focused his speech entitled "The Translation of Russian Literary Prose into the Ukrainian Language" around the painful and urgent issue of literalism in translations from and via Russian. This critic translator called the literalist strategy a depressing copyism, a gramophone that will never replace a living voice, and the most dangerous enemy of translated literature that bears the stillborn fruit. In his keynote speech, The State of Literary Translation in Ukraine, at the same meeting, Olexa Kundzič, whom I also mentioned, denounced literal translations from Russian and their disastrous impact on the Ukrainian literary language. Kundzič labeled the literalist strategy as slavish copying, the spoilage of literary language, and the clerical style, as opposed to artistic literary style. The danger of such a strategy displayed in the multi-volume editions of Russian classics and the hundreds of works of Soviet literature was that it exerted great influence on the Ukrainian literary language. As Kundzič maintained, the language of translations had overwhelmed Ukrainian literary language. Through mass publications of these translations, despite their impoverished and monotonous lexics, severed from the vital source of folk speech, Ukrainian folk speech, the artificial translation style was replacing native Ukrainian literary style. It was the most dangerous process. However, concerted opposition, so the translators were truly concerned with this fact, and their concerted opposition, Kovhaniuk, Kundzič, Boris Ten, Maxim Rylsky, their concerted opposition to slavish literalism in translations from Russian stimulated, for instance, Rylsky in particular, to develop a theory of translation from a closely related language. Rylsky, in his article Problems of Literary Translation, first circulated in 1954 and later included in Rylsky's 1975 volume, The Art of Translation. Rylsky attempted to break free from the dictates of literalism with the help of this theory. The writer-translator warned against calking from a closely related language from Russian because of the threat of misusing words similar in sound but different in meaning and other multiple threats. Through the Russian language and translations from Russian, a Soviet cultural space was established, which proved to be deliberately isolated from the world cultural space, and which was intended to supplant the latter. Thus, the period of late Stalinism from the mid-40s to mid-50s witnessed a decline in Ukrainian translation tradition, characterized by multiple retranslations and revisions of previously published works, as well as the mass phenomenon of indirect translation via Russian mediation. After the campaign against translator Rekes, as Ukrainian scholar and translator Maxim Striha maintains, publishers began to shun those translators who were active during the first Soviet decades. From 1937, these authors disappeared from publishing houses. The translators of the new conscription who came to replace those executed or exiled to the Gulag camps were often individuals of much lower culture and professionalism who had no command of foreign languages other than Russian. Moreover, the translations published in the Ukrainian SSR since the late 1930s mainly belonged to the Russian and partly European classics, but only to those authors who were considered progressive by the Communist Party. However, those translations of European classics, even of those who were considered progressive and were allowed, and the literature of the peoples of the USSR were already carried out from Russian translations. So the publication of Russian literary classics was prioritized in Ukraine. concurrently, the cohorts of Soviet Ukrainian scholars developed the concept of the Russo-Ukrainian literary interaction, commonwealth, unity, as well as linguistic relations, and the brotherhood of cultures, which all essentially sustained a Russian totalitarian monologue based on censorship and state control of book production. Daniel Monticelli terms this cultural situation where translations take a large share of book production and quote unquote, only one source language and culture is absolutely hegemonic among translations as totalitarian translation. Such translation is characterized by erasure of the previous national legacy through censorship and destruction of books and by repressing the living writer translators, making their creative individuality invisible.
Thank you, Lada.
Yes, I would like to, maybe say the finalizing, concluding statement that the national function of Ukrainian translation, which was to protect the Ukrainian language and culture, despite externally imposed bans and repressions, it has always, prevailed. It has always opposed Russification, but another tendency, the dark side of translation, prevailed from the mid-50s onward. While Russian culture has mostly been perceived by Ukrainians as the culture of an ethnically and linguistically related people, it also represents, and today more than ever, an imperial and destructive force with a clear political goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lada. Thank you.